Welcome back to Tale of Wonder. He laughed at the old gardener, a wheezing, slow figure hunched over rose bushes, until the day that gardener moved with a speed that shattered everything the young man believed about strength, power, and the true nature of a fight. Caleb was a typhoon in human form. 22 years old, every muscle a coiled spring, every thought a sharp, impatient jab. He moved through the world like he owned it, shoulders back, chin high, a permanent, almost imperceptible sneer playing on his lips. He was a promising amateur boxer, a relentless force in the ring, and the gym was his second home, a sanctuary of sweat, grunts, and the rhythmic thud of leather on canvas. But his actual home, a sprawling, modern minimalist house on the edge of the city, was where his true tests of patience began. Or rather, where his complete lack of patience was constantly, irritatingly challenged. His primary irritant came in the form of old Shelton, the gardener. Shelton was an anachronism, a relic from slower, softer era. He was perhaps 70, 75, a man sculpted by years of sun and soil, his skin like worn leather, his hands gnarled and strong, yet forever stained with earth. He moved with a deliberation that drove Caleb insane. Every morning, as Caleb powered through his morning protein shake, watching the sunrise paint the manicured lawns gold, Shelton would be out there, a silhouette against the dawn, pushing a wheelbarrow at a snail's pace, trimming hedges with the precision of a surgeon performing a bypass, or coaxing life from a stubborn patch of petunias as if he were whispering secrets to them. Caleb would watch, a flicker of contempt in his eyes, occasionally muttering under his breath, "Faster, old man. Faster. The plants aren't going anywhere." He'd seen Shelton try to lift a bag of potting soil once, struggling, grunting, his face crimson. Caleb had almost offered to help, a rare surge of something akin to pity, but then Shelton had finally heaved it up, dropped it with a puff of dust, and simply wiped his brow, a faint, contented smile on his lips. It wasn't about speed for Shelton. It was about the task, about the enduring, quiet satisfaction of coaxing beauty from the ground. For Caleb, everything was about speed. Everything was about impact. Everything was about winning. And winning quickly. One sweltering afternoon, the tension between them, usually unspoken, simmered over. Caleb was shadowboxing on the patio, his movements fluid, explosive, a dance of controlled aggression. He weaved and ducked, imaginary opponents crumbling before his precise combinations. Shelton, meanwhile, was meticulously pruning the rose bushes bordering the patio, each snip of his shears a deliberate, almost musical sound. A bead of sweat traced a path down Caleb's temple, stinging his eye. He paused, wiping it away with the back of his hand, and caught sight of Shelton, bent double, painstakingly removing a single dead leaf. Caleb scoffed, a short, sharp burst of air. "You know, Shelton," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "some people actually have things to do with their lives. Important things. Not just playing with dirt." Shelton straightened up slowly, his movements almost a caricature of slowness. He turned, his faded blue eyes, surprisingly keen, meeting Caleb's. There was no anger in them, only a calm, almost amused curiosity. "And what exactly do you do, young Caleb, that is so important?" Caleb smirked, flexing his bicep. "I train. I fight. I win. I'm building something. A career. A legacy. Something that requires actual strength, actual speed, actual purpose. Not just pottering around with flowers." Shelton nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Ah, the noble art. I remember a time when I myself knew a thing or two about swift movements. And purpose." He turned back to his roses, and Caleb took his nonchalance as a dismissal, a subtle insult to his ambition. "Swift movements?" Caleb laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "You can barely lift a bag of mulch. You move like molasses. What could you possibly know about swift movements?" He delivered a rapid-fire flurry of punches into the air, each one cracking like a whip. "This, Shelton, this is swift. This is power. This is what wins." Shelton, without turning, said, "Speed is a tool, young man. Power is a hammer. but neither is worth much without the wisdom to know when and where to strike, and when not to. Caleb bristled. The old man was lecturing him. Him, the rising star, the powerhouse. Wisdom? You think pruning roses teaches you wisdom? It teaches patience, Shelton replied, his voice soft, almost a whisper against the hum of the afternoon. It teaches observation. It teaches that growth is a process, not a sudden explosion. And it teaches that even the sharpest thorn is best handled with care. Or broken off, Caleb countered, if it gets in your way. He threw another series of brutal jabs, punctuating his words. That's my philosophy, Shelton. Break anything that gets in your way. Shelton sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. A destructive philosophy, Caleb. And often, what you think is in your way is merely a part of the path. He then picked up a small, weathered trowel, its blade gleaming dully in the sunlight, and began to carefully loosen the soil around the base of a particularly vibrant rose bush. He hummed a tuneless, ancient melody, completely absorbed in his task, seemingly oblivious to Caleb's simmering rage. Caleb watched him, fists clenched. The man was infuriating, and yet there was something in Shelton's serene absorption that bothered him, a quiet dignity that Caleb, for all his physical prowess, somehow lacked. He felt an urge, childish and strong, to provoke him further, to shatter that calm. You know, Shelton, Caleb said, his voice now dangerously low, I bet you wouldn't last a minute in a real fight. All that wisdom wouldn't save you from a left hook. Shelton slowly straightened up again, his movements still unhurried, but now a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He turned fully to face Caleb, the trowel still in his hand, held loosely. Perhaps, he said, but a real fight is rarely about the first punch, young Caleb. It is about the last one, or sometimes about the ones that are never thrown. Caleb laughed, genuinely amused now. Oh, you're a philosopher, are you? Tell me, old man, what's your secret move? The petal-plucking strike? The root entanglement grapple? He mimicked a slow, theatrical bow, mocking Shelton's stoic demeanor. Shelton's gaze intensified, a deep, unsettling clarity in his eyes. He slowly, deliberately placed the trowel down beside the rose bush. He then raised his hands, not in a defensive posture, but in a gesture that seemed to invite observation, his gnarled fingers spreading, palms facing Caleb. Tell me, young Caleb, he said, his voice quiet, do you truly understand speed? Or do you merely understand haste? What's the difference? Caleb scoffed, rolling his eyes. Haste is often frantic, uncontrolled, Shelton explained, his voice still calm, a reaction to a perceived threat. Speed, true speed, is born of stillness, of perfect balance, of knowing precisely when and where to exert minimal effort for maximal effect. Caleb found himself oddly captivated, despite himself. The old man had a strange gravitas. Show me, then, he challenged, this true speed of yours, old man. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Shelton's lips. Very well. He stood utterly still for a moment, his gaze fixed on Caleb, a strange stillness about him, as if the very air around him had grown heavy. Caleb felt a prickle of unease. Then Shelton moved. It wasn't an explosive movement, not a blur of action. It was something far stranger, far more unnerving. It was a disappearance. One moment, Shelton was standing perhaps 10 feet away. The next, he was directly in front of Caleb, his hand, surprisingly firm, resting lightly on Caleb's chest, right over his sternum. There had been no sound, no shuffle of feet, no perceptible transition. It was as if he had simply teleported. Caleb froze, his jaw slack. He hadn't seen him move. Not a single twitch, not a single step. His trained fighter's eyes, accustomed to tracking the fastest jabs and weaves, had registered nothing. 1 second, 10 feet. Next, he was there. Shelton's eyes, still calm, held a depth that Caleb had never noticed before. That, Shelton whispered, his voice soft but resonating with an unexpected power, is speed, young man. Born of observation, of patience, of knowing the shortest distance between 2 points and executing it with absolute economy of motion. He then stepped back, just as smoothly, just as imperceptibly, returning to his original position by the rose bush, picking up his trowel, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The entire encounter, from his challenge to Shelton's return, had lasted no more than 5 seconds. Caleb stood there, utterly dumbfounded. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just witnessed. It defied everything he knew about fighting, about human movement. He felt a tremor of something he hadn't experienced since he was a small boy. Genuine fear. And something else, a shattering of his carefully constructed worldview. How did you do that? Caleb finally managed to stammer, his voice a raw whisper. Shelton merely smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. Years of observing the wind, young Caleb. Years of understanding the path of a falling leaf. Years of knowing when to wait and when to act. He resumed his gardening, humming his ancient tune, leaving Caleb adrift in a sea of bewildered silence. From that day forward, something shifted in Caleb. The sneers softened, the impatience lessened, though not entirely. He still trained, still fought, but now he watched Shelton with a new, almost reverent curiosity. He saw the old man's slow movements not as weakness, but as a deliberate choice, a mask. He tried to mimic that stillness, that economy of motion in his own training, but it was like trying to catch smoke. His encounters with Shelton became less about mockery and more about unspoken observation. Caleb would sit on the patio, ostensibly scrolling through his phone, but his eyes would constantly stray to the old gardener. He'd watch Shelton methodically prune, plant, and water, each movement precise, efficient in its own slow way. He began to notice the small things, the way Shelton could predict where a weed would sprout, the way he understood the subtle language of light and shadow, the almost psychic connection he seemed to have with the earth itself. One crisp autumn morning, a new opportunity for interaction arose, though it began with another one of Caleb's accidental blunders. He was carrying a tray of freshly brewed coffee out to the patio, still half asleep, when his foot caught on a loose paving stone. The tray tilted, the ceramic mugs clattering, and a wave of scalding hot coffee arced directly towards a delicate patch of newly planted marigolds that Shelton had spent weeks cultivating. Caleb instinctively tried to correct himself, but momentum was against him. He was going down, and the coffee was going to ruin Shelton's prized work. In that split second, Shelton, who had been kneeling some 20 feet away, meticulously weeding, moved. Again, it wasn't a visible dash. It was a blur. Not a blur of speed, but a blur of efficiency. Before the first drop of coffee could hit the marigolds, Shelton was there, his hand, quick as a viper, catching the tray mid-air, steadying it with a startling strength. Not a single drop spilled. Not a single marigold was harmed. He then gently guided the tray back into Caleb's trembling hands. Shelton simply looked at Caleb, his eyes holding that familiar, knowing glint. "Careful, young man," he said, his voice even. Even stillness requires a certain swiftness to maintain. Caleb could only nod, speechless. The coffee incident further solidified the mystique around Shelton. He was an enigma, a man whose quiet demeanor hid an almost supernatural capability. Caleb tried to ask him about it again, about his speed, but Shelton would merely offer enigmatic smiles, attributing it to years of practice or knowing the rhythm of things. He never elaborated, never boasted. Caleb's boxing career progressed. He won fights, gained a reputation, but the memory of Shelton's effortless speed haunted him. It introduced a new dimension to his understanding of movement and combat. He began to see the inefficiencies in his own fighting style, the wasted energy in his powerful but sometimes overly broad movements. He started practicing stillness, balance, observation, trying to emulate the quiet economy he'd seen in Shelton. His coaches, bewildered, noted a new precision in his footwork, a surprising subtlety in his dodges. He became not just faster, but smarter. He wasn't just throwing punches, he was placing them. He wasn't just reacting, He was anticipating. Life, as it always does, continued its relentless march. Caleb's fights grew more challenging, his opponents tougher. One evening, after a particularly brutal training session, Caleb limped home, bruised and exhausted. He found Shelton in the greenhouse, humming quietly as he repotted orchids. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and exotic blossoms. "Tough day?" Shelton asked without looking up, his voice a gentle hum. "You could say that," Caleb grunted, collapsing onto a nearby bench. "This guy I'm fighting next week, he's a brawler. Heavy hands. No finesse, just power." Shelton carefully tamped down soil around an orchid root. "Power is a blunt instrument, Caleb. Useful, but easily dodged by a nimble mind." "Easy for you to say," Caleb muttered, rubbing a sore rib. "He's fast, too. Surprisingly fast for a big guy." Shelton finally looked up, his eyes meeting Caleb's. "Speed, young man, is not merely about how quickly one moves from point A to point B. It is also about how quickly one perceives the world, how quickly one decides, and how quickly one reacts. A seasoned eye can see the intention behind the movement long before the movement itself is fully committed." Caleb pondered this, a new seed of understanding sprouting in his mind. "So, you're saying I need to see his punches before he even throws them?" Shelton smiled. "In a manner of speaking, anticipation is the truest form of speed. To be already where your opponent will be is far more effective than merely reacting to where they are." This conversation, brief as it was, became a turning point for Caleb. He spent the next week studying his opponent's previous fights with a new focus, not just looking for patterns of attack, but for the subtle tells, the unconscious preparatory movements that signaled a coming blow. He trained his eyes, his mind, his body to respond not to the punch itself, but to the intent behind the punch. He focused on stillness, on being rooted yet fluid, like a willow in a storm. The fight came. It was indeed a brawler, a human wrecking ball. Caleb, for the first few rounds, danced, moved, dodged. He saw the flicker in the opponent's eye, the slight shift in weight, the tensing of a shoulder muscle, seconds before the punch flew. He was a ghost, untouchable. His opponent grew frustrated, wilder, his powerful blows whizzing past empty air. Then, in the fourth round, Caleb saw an opening. A slight overextension, a momentary imbalance. It was a tiny window, one that most fighters wouldn't even register. But Caleb, thanks to Shelton's quiet lessons, saw it with crystalline clarity. He moved, not with a frantic dash, but with a precise, almost surgical strike. A blur of movement, a perfectly placed hook, and his opponent went down, lights out. Caleb had won, not just by power, but by a speed born of stillness, by an anticipation honed by observation. He raised his hands, the crowd roared, but in his mind he saw Shelton, quietly tending his roses, a knowing smile on his lips. He returned home, triumphant, a champion. His family, friends, and coaches lauded his transformation. But Caleb sought only one person. He found Shelton in the late afternoon light, watering a bed of vibrant hydrangeas. "Shelton," Caleb said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. Your words, they changed everything. I saw it. I saw the opening." Shelton merely nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The world reveals its secrets to those who bother to look, young Caleb, and to those who learn to be still enough to truly see." Caleb wanted to know more. He wanted to understand the source of Shelton's profound wisdom, his impossible speed. He finally gathered the courage to ask, "Shelton, who are you? Where did you learn all this?" Shelton paused, his gaze drifting over the sprawling garden, over the distant city skyline. A wistful look softened his features. "I've lived many lives, Caleb, seen many things, done many things. This garden is my final chapter, my piece." He sighed, a sound like rustling leaves. "But if you must know, once, a very long time ago, I wasn't known for my slowness or my gentleness with flowers. I was known, in certain circles, as the shadow. A professional, retriever of things people didn't want found. Or, more often, a persuader of people who didn't want to be persuaded." Caleb's eyes widened. A hitman? A spy? Shelton chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. Something like that. A man who understood leverage. A man who understood the shortest distance between 2 points, and the most effective way to cross it silently. He then looked directly at Caleb, his eyes losing their wistfulness, becoming sharp, piercing, almost dangerous for a fleeting moment. My job was never about being the strongest, Caleb. It was about being the fastest mind, and moving only when it truly mattered. One swift, decisive action, and the job was done. No wasted effort. No unnecessary blows. Caleb was stunned. The gentle gardener, the quiet philosopher, had a past shrouded in violence and deadly efficiency. The pieces clicked into place. The impossible speed, the uncanny observation, the calm, almost detached wisdom. It wasn't about martial arts. It was about survival. It was about a life where every wasted movement, every missed cue could mean the end. Shelton noticed Caleb's shock, and a slight, almost imperceptible smirk touched his lips. And what does a man like that do when he wants to escape his past? He finds a place where speed is measured by the growth of a seed and power by the blooming of a rose. A place where the only fights are against weeds and blight. A place where patience is a virtue and the only kill is the pruning of a dead branch. He paused, then added, his voice tinged with a subtle irony. Though, I confess, sometimes the thrill of a precisely timed intervention, even if it's just to save a tray of coffee, still holds a certain nostalgic appeal. Caleb stared at him, unable to speak. The old man, covered in dirt, smelling of roses and damp earth, was a legend, a ghost from a past where lives hung in the balance with every swift movement. His entire perception of Shelton, of strength, of speed, had been turned on its head. The man who seemed weakest was arguably the most dangerous. The man who seemed slowest harbored a devastating, almost invisible speed. Shelton gently placed his watering can down. Now, if you'll excuse me, young champion, these hydrangeas won't water themselves. And a neglected plant, much like an unobservant fighter, will eventually wither. He gave Caleb another one of his serene, knowing smiles, then turned and slowly, deliberately, began to mist the vibrant blue blooms, his movements once again the picture of patient, unhurried calm. Caleb watched him, a slow, dawning realization washing over him. The old gardener, the shadow, had just given him the greatest lesson of his life, not with punches or power, but with a few quiet words and an almost supernatural display of controlled, devastating efficiency. And the irony was, Caleb had almost missed it entirely, blinded by his own youthful arrogance and his superficial understanding of what true strength really meant. The gardener had mocked him, not with words, but with an effortless demonstration that had completely dismantled his pride. And as Caleb left Shelton to his quiet work, walking away with a new humility and a profound respect, he couldn't help but wonder, if Shelton could still move like that, how many other hidden talents, how many other dormant strengths were concealed beneath the unassuming exteriors of the quiet, patient people he so often dismissed? The world, he now understood, held far more depth and far more dangerous beauty than he had ever imagined. He had sought power in the ring, but found true mastery in the garden, wielded by a man whose past was as sharp as his pruning shears, and whose wisdom had bloomed from a soil of secrets and shadows. Do you think true strength is always about overt power, or can it be found in the most unexpected, quiet places? If Shelton's story gave you a new perspective, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Tale of Wonder for more stories that challenge what you think you know. See you in the next video.